So when we talk about hierarchy in Azure, then first is the Azure account itself, then comes the subscriptions under it, and then resource groups and resources. So whenever we are, trying to put a certain access on a certain thing, for example, I being an employee have an Azure account. Say for example, I own the company and I have an Azure account under which there are different subscriptions, and we have different resource groups and different services that we're providing to our user base. So what we do here basically is there are different subscriptions which are given out to different departments. Basically, there is with just when we just talk about IT, then within that there is the development branch, then there is operations, quality checking, that is also called as quality management. Then there is the security part, and then there is the operations, that basically deployment. So all of those different branches are given different subscriptions. Similarly, there is also legal branch who tells sees that we are we complying to the government policies, are we complying to whatever when we start to sell different services to our user base, then there are different checks that we are going to use your data in so and such and such manner. So does those policies comply with the government policy? Are whatever policies we are telling that we are giving them, or will not use this data in this way, or we are going to use this data in this way, are we complying to that? So there's a different branch for that too. Similarly, one branch for budgeting and business sales, etc. So access cannot be given in a developer should not have access towards the budget parts. Similarly, the guy handling the budgets and sales would not have access to the development part and deployment part. So these things have to be planned properly based on this hierarchy. So for example, we can say that there is the owner or the CEO or someone else who has the Azure account. Basically, the Azure account is created after the company itself. Say for example, I'm a company called as contoso.com. So there will be my account named Contoso or contoso.com after my domain name. Within that, there will be different subscriptions. One would be IT, one would be legal, one would be sales, example like this. So under IT also there will be different other small groups within other the resource groups. What we can do is we can say that within IT we are going to provide, say for example, we are giving our users 5 to 6 services. So these services will be under different resource groups, or they might be under the same resource group, or might be under different resource groups. But it is a good practice to keep it different within different resource groups, so it is easy to manage and handle. So similarly, within those resource groups come many resources. So these resource groups, you can think of them as containers in which we can keep our resources. First of all, this is an tutorial on how to create an Azure account. Has any one of you already subscribed for not subscribed, registered for Azure for Students? Hello. Have you guys registered for Azure for Students?
It seems like some don't have Azure student account.
Yeah, actually, for registering to this event, I had created a particular form that within that form I had asked them that have you registered for GitHub Student Developer Pack and Azure for Students. So majorly I got it as a yes, and a very few people said that they haven't registered for it. So I'll just explain the difference between different accounts within Azure. One is the free account, and there is a student account. So basically, if you register for a free account, as it says here, free access to popular resources within Azure for 12 months, and you get a credit of $200 to use within Azure for 30 days, for the first 30 days. and there are about 25 services or products which are free to some extent, always. That is the Azure free account, and then the student account has access to different Azure services for 12 months, then $100 credit for 1 year, and again free access to software developing tools, and again those services which are mentioned here, 25 products that are always free. And so what is a Microsoft Learn Sandbox? So you'll be coming up with this whenever you'll go ahead and learn these, you use these Microsoft Learn modules to learn for your examination. So for example, I want to create a virtual machine and I don't have an Azure account, neither of the free account, and also not, I even don't have the student account, as well as I don't have a free account. And I don't have, say for example, a credit card to register for a pay as you go subscription, that is Azure free account. Then we can use these Microsoft Learn sandboxes. So basically these will create certain constrained environments within Azure, so we can complete certain exercises which are provided in these learning modules. For example, this is one sandbox environment. So explore how to learn the sandbox environment. Basically, they'll just ask us to use Azure PowerShell CLI. So that's a command line interface within Azure that I showed you yesterday.
How
Yes.
I can have I have another idea about to have access to Azure account. So for those who do not have access to this possibility, another way is to join the Microsoft Learn Student Ambassadors. This is another way to have access to credit of Azure. And the advantages of being Microsoft Student Ambassador is that each month you'll have a renewable credit for $150, essentially based for your Azure credit.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I forgot to tell you about the Microsoft Learn Student Ambassador program, under which when you go to the alpha milestone, then you get about $150 per month to use on certain projects that you want to put to Azure or develop onto Azure. So yeah, if you register for the students ambassador Microsoft Learn Student Ambassador program and you get to this alpha milestone, then you get access to Azure for free. So later I'll be sharing you the link for that as well. So as I said, there is this Azure CLI within which you can, rather than clicking on things and creating resources, you can simply just type in commands and it will create the things for you, provided you give in the proper arguments for doing so. Similarly, this is just asking me to get, for example, if we type this within PowerShell, this will give me a get date, the today's date. Then AZ version, basically, I can type in here. So this is the Azure CLI version within this uh, environment. So similarly, there are many exercises, and these are just tutorials to get you started. So do go through these later. This will be helpful for you when we are going to learn for uh, when you are preparing for appearing for any Azure examinations. So when we come into the physical infrastructure of an Azure facility, then we can divide it into different things. First are regions. For example, a region is a geographical area on the planet that contains at least one but potentially multiple data centers that are nearby and network together with low latency network. So for example, I'll just show you an image of Azure regions. So that you can see here there are so many data centers of Azure throughout the world. So there are different regions assigned to different areas. For example, there is the East US as well as the West US. So within the US, there is a region, said to be a region that is towards the east part of US and one towards the west part of US. Then again, within regions come availability zones. So basically, these regions are nothing but actual geographical locations on the globe where Azure has set up their data centers, and these can be these can be at least one data center to multiple data centers based on whatever Azure has decided to do. And within a region, there are multiple. If there are multiple data centers, then those data centers are connected to each other through a low latency network. Basically, they are connected to each other through fiber optic cables. So if you want to talk to other regions, or like yesterday I explained about high availability and reliability. If some mishap occurs somewhere, there is a natural disaster in one particular availability zone within Azure. If one data center goes down, then the nearest data center which is in that region itself, you can replicate your services over there. And since your users are nearby, then that since your users are nearby, they won't experience as much big of a latency as you as they would if you would replicate your resources from this particular availability zone to some other region, that is West US. If you had something in East US and you are just replicating in another availability zone within that same region, the latency will be less as compared to you replicating the same thing in West US. So that is a very nice thing to have. Then there are availability zones. So some services or virtual machines are only available in certain regions, such as specific VM sizes or storage types. So since these are, there is an actual data center, so there are different servers, and these servers, all of these servers and regions have a specific quota that they can provide to people, because there are actual limited physical things within that data center. So similarly, for example, I want to have a GPU virtual machine. So if I try to get the same thing within India, if say for example it is not available in India right now, then I'll have to use another region. So similarly, there are some types of machines and some tiers of machines and services which are only allowed in specific regions, because those hardware uh, the hardware required to provide those services is only available in that particular region. So if sometime you want to create, for example, this thing occurred for me when I wanted to create a GPU virtual machine. I was trying to create one in India, but that particular data center in India did not have it. So I just switched to East US. So I was able to create that virtual machine there. So similarly, some things are available in particular regions, some are not. If you ever come in such, if you ever encounter such a scenario, what you can do is you simply change the region and see that if it is available in that region or not. So there are some services mentioned which are available somewhere and are not available somewhere. Oh, I'm sorry. These are available regardless of any region, because these are very general services such as Azure Active Directory, Traffic Manager, and Azure DNS. So these are available regardless of any region. But there are some services, as I just mentioned, like having a GPU virtual machine. So those are only available if the quota is available in that particular region, that if there is physical hardware in that region or not. Then availability zones. What are availability zones? There's a particular Azure region, like I said. Now there is East, as you saw that there is an East US, for example, that I gave an example a few moments ago. So within East US, there might be particular different availability zones, say East US A, B, and C. So what we talked about yesterday, having high availability, means that you could have some resources within the A region and some resources in the B region. And say, for example, your user base is somewhere near A and B and not towards C. So what you can do is you can have something in A and some resources and services in B. So in case A goes down, so the services within B won't be affected. And you can also replicate your services and add them to that load balancer. I explained yesterday what a load balancer is. It divides your traffic into different services in the backend. So if, for example, availability zone 1 goes down for some reason, or your resource goes down for some reason, then there are always your resources in availability zone 2 which are always there to serve your users. Similarly, they are explaining the same thing here. One zone goes down, the other continues working. Availability zones are connected through high speed fiber optic cables. Then they are asking how to use availability zones in your apps. So I'll show you a demo by creating a virtual machine again. And I'll show you how availability zones are, how you can see them while creating a resource. So
I
for
want
example, yes,
I want to add something
sure, sure.
to help. Yeah, according to regions, so it depends on where you want to deploy your solutions. So some region I have a service which is in low cost, like for example the electricity, power, um something about taxis and other things. So, for example, if you decide to deploy your services in in Norway, you will see that the pricing is different from, for example, from Central US. So this is things like you may take in considerations. And another thing is according to the distance between where you are live. For example, you are in India. Uh, in deploying your services, you may choose India because it will be just in your country. And if you run, for example, your application or you run some services, it will not take time. And another way for availability is just to allow you to have a solution which is always available, because you can have some catastrophe like disaster recovery and natural disaster. This is can have an impact for your solution. That's why when you are choosing your region, you need to know where I want to host my services, which region is give me the availability of regions, and this may to impact your cost, the cost of the services. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I forgot to add that point. So, see, when we are in different regions and different areas, for example, the cost of electricity in India versus the cost of electricity in UK and US is different. So, definitely the cost of the virtual machine and other services differ accordingly. So, thank you, Pascal, for adding that. So, different regions and different zones provide different type of things, as well as the cost differs accordingly. So, for example, the cost of electricity in Brazil, I think, is high as compared to India. So, if you deploy a virtual machine or some other service in Brazil, it will be costlier as compared to the same resource in India. So, yeah, like I was saying, I'll show you a demo of availability zones. So, there is East US and there is an availability zone here. And now it's asking me which zone do you want? So, this basically confirms that within East US, there are three zones 1, 2, and 3. So I can deploy a machine in zone 1 and also a machine in zone 2, which do the same task and have a load balancer connected to it. So in case one zone goes down, my service is always available, providing me that high availability and helping me to achieve that service level agreement, which I have signed with my users. And also, I was telling you about the particular virtual machine, right? That I have tried to deploy a GPU in a particular region, it was not available. So let me just show you that. I think in central India is what it wasn't available. or was it a container? I think it was a container. So basically, I was trying to deploy a container, and we explained yesterday what containers are. So when I try to deploy a particular service in a particular region and the hardware for that is not available in that region, then obviously it will give an error and it won't allow us to create that resource. So see, there is a particular notification that came here. Standard SKU is available for all regions. Confidential SKU is only available for specific reasons, and we can we can go to this link and check that which particular regions have which particular SKUs available. SKUs are nothing but service tiers. So for example, this is a size, and we can set the GPU type here, and now it is telling me no GPU are available for Central India region. So within Central India region, the hardware for having a GPU for a container is not available. So that is what it is telling me here. So different within different zones also there are different services. When we talk about availability zones, there are primarily for virtual machines, manage this, and load balancers. So we talked about what virtual machines are. So we'll come into what manage disk are later because the storage section is still there behind. We talked about load balancers yesterday, and SQL databases. I think most of you will be familiar with what are SQL databases, since I think most of you come from a development background. And Azure services that support availability zones fall into three categories. So there are different categories. There is a zonal service. So basically, I pin a service or I create a service in a particular zone that is called a zonal service. Then there are zone redundant service. A platform replicates automatically across zones. So for example, I have a database and I want it to be zone redundant. So it basically, if some zone goes down, I will still have it because by default that service will replicate it within all other zones. And now there is a non-regional service. These services are always available from Azure geographies and are resilient to zone-wide outages as well as region-wide outages. So for example, I want to create a particular service, for example, say Azure DNS, right? So there are some global services which are available, and if any zone which I have created for a particular thing goes down, it will not affect my service in any way. So global services which are not based on regions won't be affected regional outages. Then there are region pairs. Most Azure regions are paired with another region within the same geography. For example, US, Europe, or Asia, at least 300 miles away. So these three regions are at least 300 miles away, but are uh, paired with each another. This approach allows for the replication of resources across a geography that helps reduce the likelihood of interruptions because events such as natural disasters, etc., etc. So when you create services within a region pair, so if some region is affected is something, then it will automatically fail over, or we could call it as a uh, fail over or domain. For example, fault domain and something called as a update domain. So there are times when we want to update our software for something, update the OS for something, for security patches. So and what an update domain does, when these updates are going to take place, it will switch on to some other region or zone that you have selected it to do so. And what is a fault domain? If anything, an error occurs and somehow or the other your service is affected in that thing, then you can set a fault domain where you select the particular number of resources to be replicated over to some zone or region of your choice. So this is showing a regional pair. So this is the Azure region. Within there are zones, another region and zones, and this is a regional pair. So anything, if something happens to this region, so automatically when you are creating things within a regional pair, your resources will be replicated into the other working region. Additional advantages of region pairs. If extensive Azure outage occurs, one region out of every pair is prioritized to make sure at least one is restored as quickly as possible for applications hosted in that region pair. So whenever an regional outage occurs or an extensive outage occurs, so Azure, when trying to uh, recreate that region or uh, kill out that problem, troubleshoot that problem, so they have a particular priority set that if this is a regional pair, we at least have to make the whole region again functional, so that whatever things are within a regional pair should be uh, replicated as soon as possible so that we can provide our users with all those services. Planned Azure updates are rolled out to paired regions, one region at a time, to minimize downtime. So if something is going to be updated within Azure, so it will happen. It will not happen simultaneously. If some update is to be done, then both regions won't be updating all the hardware and software at the same time. One region will basically they will do it in a turn by turn. So when one region is done, all of those services within a regional pair will be shifted to the other region, and when the update is over and they start to update the other region, then all the services there will be coming back to this first region, which is now ready to use. Data continues to reside within the same geography as its pair, except for Brazil South for tax and law enforcement jurisdiction purposes. So data continues to reside within the same geography as its pair. So this is the regional pair, and whatever data you have, for example, SQL databases or some other storage services which you are using, it will continue to reside within the same geography within that region pair. So for example, if we give out two regions such as East and West US, and we create something within that pair, so our data will not go outside that pair for any reason, except for this particular region, Brazil South, which is due to tax and law enforcement jurisdiction purposes. So basically, there are sometimes policies given by government that Azure has to follow. So things need to be changed in that way so it meets the government's policies. Then there are sovereign regions. In addition to regular regions, Azure also has sovereign regions. Sovereign regions are instances of Azure that are isolated from the main instance of Azure. You may need to use a sovereign region for compliance and legal purposes. So, for example, when we are talking about having something from the government or something related to the government, then there are particular things, particular government policies that we need to follow. So in this particular time, what we can do is we can use the sovereign regions. So they are given particular region types which can be used and very well be complied with the local government policies. Sure. So basically, what is the total advantage of this? That the physical and logical network is isolated instances of Azure. So normally, what happens is when we are talking about Azure, it is a whole global network. Because I showed you, how many regions are there in Azure. It has so many data centers in the whole world, and these are interconnected to each other from undersea cables and also land fiber optic cables. So when we talk about sovereign regions, these are isolated from the global network. This is because of, for example, a US government agency and government partners. For example, if they want to host something within Azure or some other cloud provider, so for meeting the government policies, these particular regions are created. So whatever the policies are, that my data should not leave this thing, my network should not be connected to this thing, exam, etc., etc., need will be met with if you use these sovereign regions. So there are again examples within China East and China North, and there are more regions which provide those particular government uh, compliances. And similarly, there's a particular example about China that normally the within when we're talking about these data centers, they are operated by and screened by the US personnel and include additional compliance certifications. These three data centers that are here, and there are more too. Similarly, within China, so those data centers are there's a bit basically a unique partnership between Microsoft and 21 ViaNet. So this is a governmental, cloud-based IT sector, which is handled by the Chinese government. So here, those data centers within China are not actually maintained by Azure, but are maintained by this company. Askal, do you wish to add anything?
No, no, it's right.
So about Azure management infrastructure. So we are coming to Azure resources and resource groups. As I explained before, that a resource group can be explained as a basic building block where you deploy and provision your all of your services, networking, and other things. So you can think of it as a block for proper management and connectivity. So resource groups are simply groupings of resources. As the name suggests, you can have different resources inside the resource group. Excuse me. So whenever basically you're creating a resource, you're required to place it into a resource group. So when you see, if I don't provide a resource group here, just let me refresh this. So basically, if I want to create any resource and I don't provide it with the resource group in which the resource is to be created, then Azure will not allow me to provision that resource. So this is because of a basic hierarchy that is followed within Azure, which I showed you earlier. First is the account owner, then there is the subscription. Within subscription comes the different resource groups, and after resource groups come different resources. So if any of that hierarchy between those three is not there, then the lower hierarchy cannot exist. So if a subscription is not there, then resource group cannot exist, and if an account is not there, then subscriptions cannot exist. So basically, when you talk about resources, so one resource can only be part of one resource group at the same time. For example, if I want to have a virtual machine called my machine one, so my machine one cannot be part of two resource groups at the same time. It needs to be in one particular resource group only, and resource groups cannot be nested. You cannot have a resource group inside a resource group for different types of if you want to keep things organized and managed. What you can do is, instead of having a different resource group, you can basically, if you want to have a resource group inside a resource group, you can just create an other resource group separately and connect that to this network, which is there is a service which will come later called as virtual network peering, which will allow you to connect resources within these two different resource groups. So for example, if when we talk about networking, there is a virtual network that I have created in one resource group, and I have created another resource group having a different network. So by default, both of those networks won't be able to talk to each other because of the constraints of the resource group and the network itself. To make them talk to each other, we use a different service called as virtual. network peering, also called as VNet peering, which will allow us to connect both of those networks within the within the same resource group. And if the networks are connected, then we can always create connect all those resources to each other because the network is the same now. So, when we are provisioning resources in different resource groups, then we should think, for example, I want a service for, say, a web application, some cognitive service that whenever image is, uploaded to the website will do optical character recognition on it and provide me the text back. For example, this is the scenario. So you won't go adding that cognitive service to some other resource group which has resources for some other service. So that is basic logic that you will be using. So they've also given you an example. If you're setting up a temporary development environment, grouping all the resources together means you deprovision all the associated resources at once by deleting the resource group. So another advantage of a resource group is that when you create the resource group, all the services under that resource group are created by are deleted by default. So for example, you have a particular service which used, say, 10 resources, and now somehow or the other your company has decided that now let this be the end of this resource, where we won't be continuing to provide these service to our users. So what you can do is you simply delete the resource group, then all of the services within that thing is deleted. So it is very convenient to remove and again provision resources within Azure using resource groups. So now there are Azure subscriptions. So as I was telling you, first is the Azure account. Within then there are different subscriptions, and these subscriptions are based on what different sectors or domains you are under. For example, there is the product. They have given a good example: product subscription. There is the production team, there is the test team, and there is the development team. So all of these will have different levels of access and different allowances. So using this you can do proper management, as well as your budget will stay properly with each of them. So for example, a person from the test subscription need not know anything from the development part uh, of the subscription part. Basically, if you have the access to the subscription, then you have access of everything under that. So identity and access management is a whole different thing that will come to later. And there are, so basically, if you want to give access to something, it can be given from a network level, from the subscription level, from the Azure account level, from the resource level, and from the resource group level. And there are many other different levels, but these are the general ones assigned there. So for example, these are different subscriptions: a development subscription, test subscription, and the production subscription. So using this, you can do easy management and billing. So an Azure account have multiple subscriptions, and it is only, but the minimum is to only have one if you want to use any resource. If as long as you have one subscription, you can provision resources. In a multi-subscription account, you can use subscriptions to configure different billing models and apply different access management policies. So when you want to do different type of, for example, if you want to deploy a different billing model, like for example, say there is a visual, for example, for me, I have a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. So under that subscription there are different types of things that come in, and different types of services and quotas that I'm allowed to use. So basically, management can be properly designed and uh, crafted in a way so it meets uh, your policies or your requirements. Yes, your requirements. So you can have particular policies and restrictions and allowances within a particular subscription, and different things based on different levels of access to be provided to different teams with these subscriptions. So there's a billing boundary and there's an access control boundary. So this subscription type determines how an Azure account is built for using Azure. You can create multiple subscriptions for different types of billing requirements. Azure generates separate billing reports and invoices for each subscription so that you can organize and manage costs. So when we're talking about having the billing for a subscription, then the subscription for one particular the bill for a particular subscription is different from other subscriptions. So this is how you can track your costs properly and effectively. So for example, you see that our dev team has costed us about $10,000, whereas the test team has costed us 5,000 and production team has costed us about nearby $7,000. So you can see properly, okay, this thing and this resource by this used by this person and controlled by this person has costed me this much. This is how you always go on tracking your costs and see whether if there are things that you're not using and you're paying extra for that. And again, there is an access control boundary. Azure applies access management policies at a subscription level. And you can create separate subscriptions to reflect different organizational structures. So basically, as I said, that different resources within a within a subscription can be provisioned based on the level of access you provide to people. So for example, there can be an administrator, for example, a network administrator. A network administrator will be given particular access. He can do things within that network, but say for example, he will not be able to delete things. For example, he is allowed to connect things and the networking part he is given access to, but doing particular things, or for example, if you want to scale up things or increase the size of a virtual machine, then there are particular things that he is not that particular role is not suited for that. If I want to do something with a virtual machine, I want to change its hardware configuration, I want to do something with the hardware thing, then why do I need to give that access to a network administrator? So differently, when you're talking about a subscription, within a subscription can be different types of access provided to different people, which is also called as the access control boundary. So based on your team, your development team may have access to certain resources, but they need not have any access to the billing part of the resources. So again, based on what model your company follows, you can properly give the particular access that is needed for that particular person. When we talk about cybersecurity, there's a golden rule that is to be followed always. That it is also called as zero trust. Basically, we cannot trust anyone, and everyone who is within our company is to be provided with the least access so that he can do his work. So we give people just that much access that is needed for him to do his job. If I give him certain access that is extra than just doing his job, then if for example his account if his account gets compromised in some way, then that hacker will also have that access to different things, which we always want to avoid. That is why we follow this rule as zero trust and least access. Then creating additional Azure subscriptions. Similar to using resource groups to separate resources by function or access, you might want to create additional subscriptions for resources or billing management purposes. So for example, there are teams, when we're talking about teams, then generally we will go with subscription level segmentation. When there's a particular team, that team will be given a different subscription, that you handle this thing, and whatever your budget and whatever your budget will be will come under the subscription. So this will help us in proper management and tracking of our costs. So what we can do is, if some other team is added to our company, then what we can do, instead of just adding a resource group for that team, what we can do is we can create an additional subscription for that team. So we can always see what kind of uh, things that they are using and what are the costs of the particular resources within that subscription. Environments, you choose to create certain subscriptions to set up separate environments for development and testing security, or to isolate data for compliance reasons. This design is particularly useful because resource access control occurs at subscription level. So as we said, the resource access occurs at the subscription level. If you have the access of, if you're given the access as the owner of the subscription, or as the tenant, as the owner of that particular tenant, then you basically have all the access to everything under that subscription. So that access thing starts from the subscription itself. So for example, there is a particular thing that I want to secure very uh, in a very secure manner. I need to keep that data for some reason. Then what I can do is I can create a particular subscription in itself. So I need not worry about anything, because only people that I will be adding into that thing will have access to it. For example, say for example, I have a particular subscription and I wanted to add some very confidential data within that subscription in a new resource group. When I created the resource group, I did not give anyone permission to that resource group itself. Only one person who is responsible for that data. But somehow or the other, I gave some a particular person access to the resource group, to the subscription. So even without me giving him access to that resource group, he already has access to that particular resource group, because he's the owner of the subscription, or he has some level of access within that subscription. So what we can do in such cases is that we can just create a new subscription and uh, add things, or create our particular environment within that subscription. Then organizational structures. So again, for proper management, you can create subscriptions, is what they want to tell, that you could limit one team to lower cost resources, and having a proper organization and management, while allowing the IT department whatever things that they want. So basically, for your organization architecture, like when you have a particular organization and you want to assign resources and services, what you do is you have certain teams that you have created, and above that team are there team managers. Above that manager is another manager. So that same architecture of your organization can be replicated to Azure. And using this, you can what also you can do is that you can limit one team's cost to your maximum or minimum threshold that you have set. For example, there was a team that used, for example, there are two teams within one subscription, and you are, say, for example, you are assigning them, both of those teams, a budget. But certainly you come to know that your budget has exhausted. And now when you're going back and checking, then you have to check through all of those resources of both of those teams. So this will, cost time, and it will be a hectic process. So what you could do is that you could just create a particular two different subscriptions for these teams, and now you can easily see that which team is costing me more. Basically for better management, and similarly for billing, that we are talking since a long time about billing, how we can lower the cost and track cost back to which team is using the most, or are there any underutilized services that we are provisioning. Then again, there is this thing called as Azure management groups. The resources are gathered into groups, and resource groups are gathered into subscriptions. If you're just starting in Azure, that might seem like enough hierarchy to keep things organized. But imagine if you're dealing with multiple applications, multiple development teams in multiple geographies. So when we're talking about big organizations, is when that Azure management groups comes into picture, which will help you even manage more efficiently. So when whatever scenarios that I gave before are about single things and small companies, if you think of it, a single example, two, three teams. But when you're talking about multiple teams, 15, 20, 30, say for example 50 teams, 60, 100 applications, and in different geographies, because your user base is distributed throughout the globe. Now how do you manage things? Won't it become very hectic for you to uh, have different teams, different subscriptions, and different uh, applications in different geographies? So if you have many subscriptions, you might need a way to efficiently manage access policies and compliance for those subscriptions. So here is when management groups come into picture. So what happens is these groups, they provide you a scope above subscriptions. So when you talk about a management group, in the hierarchy, it comes above subscription. So when you organize subscription into containers called management groups and apply governance conditions to the management groups, all subscriptions within a management group automatically inherit the conditions applied to the management group. So you can think of it as the parent class and a child class of that of the OOPS concept, object oriented programming concept. So for example, there is, you can think of the management group as the parent and the subscriptions as the children. So those childrens will inherit whatever qualities were there in the parent. So basically whatever governance policies that you apply to a management group will automatically be provide all to all of the subscriptions within that management group. All subscriptions within management group automatically inherit the conditions applied to the management group, and same way that resource groups inherit from subscriptions and resources inherit from resource groups. So basically if you provide so there are some things that need to be applied at a management group level, some things that need to be applied at the subscription level, and some things that need to be applied at the account level. That for example, you are some company and you have nothing to do with say machine learning. You have nothing to do with machine learning, and somehow or the other you have decided that we are not going to use machine learning for anything. Somehow they just consider this scenario. So what you can do is that whatever subscription you have, or basically you can create a governance policy and put that on a management group. Say for example, you have two subscriptions and you have put that under a management group, and you have decided that both of the subscriptions will not have to do anything with say machine learning. So what you can do is that you can create a policy which will restrict these both this management group from accessing machine learning any machine learning service. So by default, this will be followed by all of those things under this management group, the subscription resource group and the resources within it. As you can see, this is the root management group. Within that, there is human resources, another management group, and another thing that management groups can be stacked on each other. As you are seeing here, this was the root management group, the main management group. Under that, they created a human resources, an IT and marketing, and they had two site subscriptions. And under the human resources, you can see that dev test subscription and apps. And under IT, there is production, then region 1, region 2, again subscriptions. And in under marketing, they have again two subscriptions. So based on your the hierarchy and organizational model that you follow within your organization, you can try to replicate that using management groups too. So as I explained, that create a hierarchy that applies a policy, that there are some policies that you can apply at a root management level. That for example, our company has nothing to do with this, so we block the access to these things. Similarly, for example, you want to restrict the HR department from accessing some certain resources which are not at all useful for them, not at all uh, useful for them basically. So you apply that governing policy at the human resources at the HR department management level, and that will be followed going downwards to the hierarchy, within the hierarchy. So again, provide user access to multiple subscriptions. So by moving multiple subscriptions under a management group, you can create one Azure role-based access control assignment on a management group. So for example, that there is someone, for example, there is a manager, say who stands at the HR level, the HR manager. So for example, you want him to have access to this apps as well as to this dev test subscription. So what you can do is you can give him a role-based access policy. You can create a policy for him giving access to this whole management group itself. So by that you just you don't need to give him separate access to apps, this management group as well as this subscription.
How? It's like he had an internet issue. So I want to talk something about Azure, just to give you an overview or a general idea of what is Azure.
Hello,
And
am I audible?
yeah, Raul,
Yes.
just give me a couple of minutes just to talk about, to give a general idea quickly about Azure so that we can continue and things to be easy.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. As I was just saying, it's just Azure. It's a cloud. It's a cloud services which allow you to do a cloud computing. So basically, it's just you don't need to buy a physical server, a physical computer, um, a physical machines to run your workload, because all that thing is it is very cost for you to invest. And the easy way is just you can use a cloud computing services which will allow you to host your services. And with Azure is just working like a virtualizations, like it emulates your material to a virtual materials. Like if you have already used, for example, VMware, for example, in your computer, you can run into your physical computer another operating system. That is basically the way that Azure is designing to help people and to help enterprises. And with these virtualizations, you can emulate different machines. For example, you can emulate a container, you can emulate, for example, your SQL server, you can emulate your Windows server. This is just to allow you to not spend a lot of money for buying um a new things. And the capability of Azure and the cloud services is just to have a possibility to scale your machines. Like, for example, you host your website which contain a database, and you may see some period of time that you have much more traffics, and you see that your computer has not this possibility to get this all informations. And inside the cloud computing, you can scale, you can upgrade your resources to support all traffics and all informations. And the concept of resource group, this is like it's like in environment where you deploy your different resources. For example, for example, in your university, and in university you can have different department, like different department for IT, department for software developer, department for example, for database management. And all departments, you can organize it into Azure, just the way you can separate each department with others. And in this resource group, once you deploy your virtual machine or your services, there is some resource which needs a connection, like which needs a network. And for example, when you are deploying machines like SQL Server, you will need to set up a virtual private network, which will allow your server to communicate with other machines. For example, you want to deploy your domain controller into Azure. Firstly, you need to have a resource group where you will isolate your your machines. And when you're deploying your 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 domain controller, your servers, for example, Windows Server 2022, and there you'll define your virtual network. And this virtual network will allow your server to communicate with other resources. For example, once you have deployed your domain controller, you want to deploy, for example, your application servers, and these applications will get information from user which is in your domain, just as like for examples. And to communicate, the communication between your domain and your application server, it will be inside your virtual network. And this virtual network is not accessible publicly because it's protected. It's supposed to be a local network. And all that things is virtually. And with Azure, you will have you will have a physical server, a power physical server, which have a possibility to run all that machines, and a switch which allow you to setting up different networks that can allow your resources to communicate each others. And after that, for example, you can have the idea, for example, to make a communication to allow your server to communicate with the public. And there you will have other services which can, for example, express routes, for example, a VPN which can give access to the local environment to a public environment, and the information is encrypted. And in this idea, that is how Azure works. So you don't need to start buying resources, physical resources, but you just, for example, you have your own business which is working, and you see that you spend much money, for example, paying, for example, troubleshooting, paying, for example, software licenses, paying, for example, a developer tools. And this is main cost for enterprises. And you can decide to migrate your workload to a cloud services. And in the cloud services, you will find different category of cloud services. This is depends the way your solution you want to be executed. And with Azure, you have all that possibility. You have different solutions which can allow to build your solution and to respond to a real world problems. And the advantage of cloud services is just you don't need to pay a lot of money. You just pay what you are using, and it depends on services. So and before you to have your resources running, you need to have your the account. This is account is just a directory which inside your directory you can have possibility to deploy your resource group, and inside your resource group you can deploy other resources. And with the account you can associate subscriptions, or maybe you can add other subscription which can make a repetition with this subscription is, for example, for IT department, and subscription is, for example, for software developers. And so I think it's all.
Yeah, so thank you, Pascal. So we'll be going on to Azure Compute and Networking Services now. Also, let's just do this knowledge check. What happens to resources within a resource group when an action or setting at a resource group level is applied? Does the current resource inherit the setting but future resources don't? The future ones inherit the setting but current ones don't. Setting is applied to current and future resource. So basically, if you apply a policy at a resource group level, then currently or in future, will all of the resources within that resource group be applied that policy? Yes. Then again, there can only be one resource. A resource can only be in one resource group at a time, and the Azure feature that replicates resources across different regions that are at least 300 miles away from each other is region pairs. Now coming to Azure Compute and Virtual Network Services. First is the Azure Virtual Machine. So what are Azure Virtual Machines? So basically we talked about virtual machines virtualization yesterday. Then that similar thing within cloud virtual machine is an Azure Virtual Machine. So basically when you have a virtual machine, you have the total control over the operating system. You have the ability to run custom software. Basically whatever software you write, you can run on it as you do it on your own PC. And then you can have a custom hosting configuration. When we are talking about say hosting service within Azure, for example, Azure Web Apps, then there are certain things that you don't control. So for example, I had an application before which needed which needed command line access in the backend to run something. So what I was doing was that I had a website, and I was on a button click, the camera opened on my desktop, and it clicked a photo of me from the browser itself and send that to a Python script running in the backend through the command line interface, and that ran a machine learning model that understood my face, and again a photo was clicked to check if my face matched with it or not. So next time when I want to log in into my application, then that face thing comes up again, and if my face matches with the older thing, the older face which I registered there, only then will I be allowed into the main page of the application. So similarly, if you want to do anything custom within with the virtual machine itself, it is possible. But when the same web service that I'm talking about now, if I actually tried to host that on Azure Web Apps, but since you don't get full access to that directory uh, of your code directory when you're uploading your code to Azure Web Apps, so the command line interface was not opening when the picture was being clicked because it did not have access to this command line interface. So you can use custom hosting configurations. You can host, you can add your so see, when you go towards this padlock, you have a certificate assigned to it, which is telling me that this is a verified website. So there are certifying authorities. You can have any certifying authority of your choice. You can have any domain name that you want, and you can host it customly in such a way using your virtual machine itself. So basically, it gives you full access, and only thing you're not responsible is for the hardware itself. That is what Azure is responsible for, but the remaining part is your responsibility. So Azure VM also gives us flexibility of virtualization without having to buy and maintain physical servers. You can also use any custom uh, uh, OS image in this. So I can have any Linux image, I can have Pop OS, I can create a own OS for myself and use it here. So it will do it for me any type of ISO image can be provided to Azure VMs. You can scale VMs in Azure. So you can run a single VM for testing, development, or minor tasks, or you can group VMs together to provide high availability, scalability, and redundancy. So as we discussed before, high availability and scalability. So we can scale VMs in Azure by putting them under a virtual machine scale set. This is the next thing that we'll be talking about. So virtual machine scale sets are nothing but they let us create and manage a group of identical virtual machines which are placed behind a load balancer. So for example, if I place three virtual machines inside a virtual machine scale set, and I can provide that this is my minimum threshold and this is my maximum threshold. And based on this certain parameter, I want you to scale up, and based on this certain parameter, I want you to scale down. So basically, for example, say that I have this virtual machine here, three of my virtual machines, and I'm detecting that the CPU utilization of three of these machines is going above, say, 80% right now. So what I wanted to do is add more machines to this scale set. And when the CPU utilization decreases, say to about 50% or so, I want you to decrease those virtual machines so I can save on costs. So that is what the virtual machine scale sets enables me to do. And all of these machines are behind a load balancer. So for example, you can have a single service running in this. Say for example, I have a web application running in all of these virtual machines, and according to the traffic that I am getting hit with, I can scale up and scale down. That is how I provide with high availability to my users. Then virtual machine availability sets. Then now what availability sets are? As we say, talked about availability zones before. There's something called as availability sets. So about availability zones before, if one zone went down, we could use machines, we could use resources from the other zone. Similarly, within the set, if one machine goes down, it will replicate that into another uh, server rack. So this again depends upon two things. This has two particular options under it. One is the update domain, one is the fault domain. So update domain groups VM that can be rebooted at the same time. This allows you to apply updates while knowing that only one update domain grouping will be offline at a time. So when I want to update my machines, my virtual machines, at that time there will be a particular update domain set that when these machines are there, so fall back to this update domain. At that time, the update domain thing will be used and my service won't be going down. Similarly, there is a time when there is a fault domain. Fault domain, if some problem occurs in my machine, if say my RAM utilization goes say about 100%, when our RAM utilization hits 100%, our CPU, the Windows OS will go and restart itself. Similarly, the similar thing happens in Linux also. So when Windows will restart itself, then obviously my service will go down too. So what the fault domain will do is that it will the service will fall back to another fault domain that is declared, and while these machines recover them, or for example a rack goes down in the data center, then they will be replicated into the fault domain. The fault domain will be used, and my service will not be getting a downtime. These are examples when to use virtual machines during test and development, when running applications in the cloud, when extending your data center to the cloud, during disaster recovery. So for example, I have a particular, say for example, mishap occurred on my private data center or on a different zone in Azure, which I had my machines in, and I replicated them in another zone. So what we could do is we can move those machines to the cloud with virtual machines. So my private data center was, it came under a natural disaster, and we had loss of many physical servers. So we still need to at least give service to our users. So what we could do is that whatever applications we are running within our own private data center can be migrated into cloud for the time that we want things to recover in a private data center. Then VM resources, there are certain parameters that are used when you are creating virtual machines. When you provision a virtual machine, you'll have the chance to pick the resources that are associated with that virtual machine, including the size. So basically, size is the number of processors or cores, which is called as virtual cores in Azure, and the amount of RAM within the virtual machine. Another thing is purpose. So there are different tiers of or different families of machines that are created which are optimized for a particular thing. So there are some virtual machines which are optimized for storing things better. Some are for reading things faster. Some are for better computation. Some are for better networking. So similarly, the purpose can be defined in the when setting this parameter. Then one is storage disk, hard disk drives. You can have SSDs, HDDs, and these also come under different tiers or SKUs. Within SSD, there is the standard SSD and there is the premium SSD. Again, under hard drives also there are different tiers. When you talk about networking, then there are virtual networks, public IP addresses, and port configurations. So when we have a network and we are creating a virtual network to stay in our for our virtual machine to stay in. So it can communicate with us who is particularly outside the Azure network, and different other machines within the private network itself. Then each machine is assigned a public IP address using which you can log into that machine using SSH or RDP. Then there are port configurations. For example, you want a service to run on a particular port, as there are 2 raised to 16 ports available on each machine. So there is a particular port that you want to run in the backend so that it could connect to some other service. So you can keep those ports open depending on what your requirement is. Then there is an exercise using this Azure Sandbox where you create a virtual machine. So basically, if you sign in using your Microsoft Learn account, then you can create a virtual machine from the sandbox itself. So this is basically the Azure Cloud Shell. So which CLI I showed you here, that same thing will be coming up in the right side as soon as I log in and activate this sandbox. So you can create the virtual machine using this. See, there is the AZ command, which basically calls the Azure CLI. They are telling the virtual machine and the parameter is create. I want to create a virtual machine where the resource group, I'm naming the resource group that sandbox resource group name, which is basically a variable declared within the Cloud Shell. So it will be using a unique ID from the Cloud Shell itself. Then I'm naming my virtual machine my VM. I'm telling the image as Ubuntu LTS and username as your user, and I generate an SSH key using which I can connect to that machine. So this is the whole exercise that you can create a virtual machine, set different parameters. So this is another command to configure your Nginx server on your virtual machine. So basically, Nginx is a hosting service within Ubuntu. So what this is doing is uh, this is creating this is basically downloading a bash script which will run and execute an Nginx server. So basically, if you click on the public IP of that virtual machine, then web page will be shown to you that welcome to Nginx or something like that. So then there is another service called as Azure Virtual Desktop. So Azure Virtual Desktop is a desktop application which virtualizes the desktop itself, and it runs on cloud. It enables you to use cloud-hosted version of Windows from any location, and Azure Virtual Desktop works across devices and operating systems. So regardless of your operating system, you can have a Windows machine anywhere because some desktop within somewhere in the world is virtualized for you through Azure. And this works with apps that you can use to access remote desktops and or most modern browsers. This is a video which gives you an overview of what Azure Virtual Desktop is. So has anyone used RDP here, remote desktop protocol? So basically, when we are talking about Windows, like there is this whole GUI system of Windows, the whole OS. So RDP is nothing but you might have used TeamViewer or AnyDesk, right? So that is again usage of the remote desktop protocol itself. Similarly, the Azure Virtual Desktop uh, is another usage of the remote desktop protocol also, which helps you uh, remotely log in a GUI manner, like you have in Windows. You can click on things and stuff, uh, and do whatever you want. But within the SSH connection, that only allows you connection to the terminal, the command line interface. So another good thing about this is that it has enhanced security because it can be paired with Azure Active Directory. So when we are talking about Active Directory, then each Windows machine has a Active Directory. For example, the directory in my machine has two users. One is the administrator, one is the user Rahul, which is me. Then again there are different roles set as network. I can show you here that there are different roles set for different things. You go to properties here, you can go to security, and you can see that there is this Rahul, there is this system, and there are different groups depending on different things. If I go over to drive C, then here you might be able to see different. See, there is this another group called as authenticated users. There is another group called as system administrators, users, account unknown, etc. So again, this can be done through Azure Active Directory. Normal is the a normal thing is the Active Directory, which is a part of your own Windows operating system, which helps in user management. And there is Azure Active Directory. So this is a Active Directory which is on Azure, which helps you create and manage people. There is the whole service here. I can show you here. Azure Active Directory. So you can create this and assign different people different types of access based on different things that you are doing. So I can create users and groups, and I can define different groups and give certain access to groups that can do different things, and I can put users under it. For example, I want a group which can access a network which I am providing it with. I give that policy to the group. So whatever users I'm providing within putting in that group will by default have all of that all of that access within the policy that I provided for the group. So multi-session Windows 10 or Windows 11 deployment. Azure Virtual Desktops let you use a Windows 10 or Windows 11 Enterprise multi-session, the only Windows client-based operating system that enables multiple concurrent users on a single VM. So if you normally try to use the RDP protocol that is here, if I type here RDP and I try to connect to a virtual machine, then if I also connect using this RDP from another machine, then this session which was logged in first will be cancelled out. This will be logged out automatically, so the other person trying to log in can log in. But using this, you can have multi sessions. So basically, two or three people at the same time can have RDP access of the same machine. The next service is Azure Containers. So we have already talked about what are containers, but I'm seeing new faces here today. So I'll give you a gist about things. When we're talking about virtualization and virtual machines, then there's another concept coming as containers. So virtual machines are yes.
I want just to come back for a second. According to virtual desktop and for accessing with RDP. Yeah. I want to say that with RDP, you can it allow you to get access graphically to your computers, which is in Windows or Windows operating systems. And with SSH, you can access in consoles. So the with with virtual desktop and accessing via RDP is not allowed to access publicly, like just for experimental, just to see, because it's not allowed and it required to use a combination of RGB and SSH, which is Azure Bastions. This is allowed to access publicly and securely to your virtual machines like Windows. So if you will use RDP just for experimentations, just for tests, but if you are in an environment production or in an into enterprise, you can must reinforce your security. That's why you can use another protocol is another services, which is Azure Bastions. Yeah.
Yeah, so another service is Azure Bastion that will be coming. Actually, it is not in the scope of AZ900, but for the next exam, that is Azure Administrator. So there's a particular thing called as Azure Bastion service which comes in this. So another a good thing about Azure Bastion is you can access your virtual machine from the browser itself instead of having an
Yeah.
RDP client connecting to it, and it is very more secure as compared to normal RDP connection.
Yeah.
But whenever we are talking about having a proper enterprise connect, when we have an enterprise environment, that is when we use this VDI solution, that is Azure Virtual Desktop, and again Azure Bastion too. So about containers, what containers are? Whiteboard is not loading. To whiteboard home, new whiteboard. So I'll just finish this very quickly. So basically, when we're talking about virtual machines, there is the hardware. Let's not talk about virtual machines and only talk about a normal machine. There is the hardware. Then there is the OS, which has the kernel, which talks to the hardware, and on that OS are some applications that are that are being hosted. And when we are talking about containers, so containers are very lightweight, and only things that are required to run the OS itself are there, and many things that are extra have been removed out of that container. It basically depends on your requirement. A container can also be heavyweight, but in most cases it is very lightweight. And the best thing about that is a container does not create a new kernel for itself. So when I have this PC, and on this I put, for example, a tier 2 hypervisor such as VMware or Hyper-V, and I create a virtual machine on this. So that virtual machine, when it is being created, it will create the kernel for itself. Whereas if I when I you know use a service such as Docker, it will directly use the underlying kernel in my own Windows OS, and just add threads whenever it wants to execute task. So that is why containers are very fast. I showed uh, an implementation of containers using Docker yesterday. So I showed how containers work, how an Ubuntu image, which is normally 3 GBs, when installing a container for it is only about 30-40 MBs, and how fast it starts. When you create a normal Ubuntu machine in some other hypervisor, it will take, I think, about 15 to 20 minutes to initialize. Whereas when you're talking about a container, it starts within this time span. That's how fast it is. So when you're talking about containers in our solutions, then there are times when we don't need, that much computational power as a virtual machine. So for example, a virtual machine, the lowest one is able to provide me with, for example, say we'll have vague terms to talk about the computational power. Say a virtual machine is providing me with 500 points of computation by default. The lowest machine is providing me with 500 points of computation, but my requirement at times is going as down up to say 250 points of computation. So what I can do is I can have multiple containers and scale up and down based on my requirement. That is how I can, you know, cut down on my cost of that virtual machine too. So basically, these are very lightweight computational devices or boxes that can do computation, which are called as Azure containers. And we are talking when talking about platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and when you talk about the responsibility about this comes nearby in the platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. So it is you at times you have access to hosting and things, at times you don't, but container is between that platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. That is why it is a new service called as container as a service. Pascal, do you want to add anything to this? Actually, we explained this in detail yesterday, but since there are new faces, I just gave a brief thing of what containers are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So what thing I want to add is just according to containers, it's another way to host a services which is a resource that allow you. It is not, if for example, if you have your applications, for example, your applications which doesn't need to deploy an operating system like Windows, like for example, um, uh, many applications inside. You can use just a container which is a low resources where you can deploy, for example, your application. Let's take an example for easy understanding. Um, so I have, for example, my services, which is like online sales. And with online sales, I've deployed, for example, some some microservices. And this microservices is just to allow my website to communicate easily and to respond easily to clients. And these applications, I don't need to deploy, for example, a Windows server to host, or for example, I don't need to deploy another operating system. I just to take my application and just to move it to a container. And and with a container is it's not heavy, it's not heavy. It's just a way to execute quickly or your applications without needing to setting up other things that are like other protocol or other services to run your applications. And the container, it can be used in different way, and it just depends on the way you want to build you want to execute your solutions. And inside Azure, you'll have a different tools which can allow you to see some the metrics how your container is working on. Yeah.
So this is also another example, diagram of how a container looks in the architecture, hardware, then kernel, OS. On top of that, there is a containerization service, and upon that, there is the application itself. And the best thing about containers is that whatever dependencies you have when you're creating a container and you add those dependencies in that container, when you are replicating that container somewhere else, then again those dependency problems won't occur. So going on to the next service, that is Azure Functions. So Azure Functions is a serverless compute option. So basically, there is no particular, when we think about serverless, then there is no server, there is no virtual machine, there is no container, nothing is there. Only there is a code which is there, which is running, which works on a trigger and does some action uh, that is your code itself. It does some computation and shows that on an endpoint. That is a website. So as it says, Azure functions are event driven. It is serverless. It does not have a backend as a virtual machine. Like when Azure is doing it, that is a different thing. But when you are acting with that service, when you're using that service, for you it is just an interface where you're adding your code, and that code is running on a trigger and shows that on an gives some result on an endpoint. That is a website. And you can do basically attach that to APIs. There is some API which goes and puts a post request or some basically a post or get request on this event trigger on this serverless compute service, that is Azure Functions, and it does some computation and it shows its results on another endpoint. So the best thing about this is that whenever this service runs, whenever your code is triggered, is only when this service runs. So you only pay for the time that this is being used for. So this is very helpful in a microservices architecture. As we talked before, containers are also very useful in microservices architecture. So are Azure functions. So when we have a particular architecture, when code is only to be run when on a particular trigger, and that trigger is not always there. It is only for a limited time at certain intervals, or basically it's not being used all the time. Then you can move on to this service, and it will help you reduce your costs very much by a big difference. That is the gist of this service. They are stateless, so basically functions can either be state or stateless or stateful. When they're stateless, they behave as if they restarted every time, and they respond to an event. When they're stateful, context is passed through the function to track prior activity. So if you want, you can set them to be stateful or stateless. So when it is stateless, then it will just do whatever you have asked it to do as default, and behave as if just they restarted the code. But when it is stateful, then you have to provide it a context, or you have to tell it that what the context can be, so it can go through that context and then go through your whatever task is there. And you can also track prior activity. That is why again it is called stateful. So functions are a key component of serverless computing, and they're also a general compute platform for running any type of code. So another thing, a good thing about this is that regardless of any programming language, you can use all of these famous languages that are out there in Azure Functions, and it will run your code basically. If the needs of developer apps change, you can deploy the project in an environment that isn't serverless. This flexibility allows you to manage scaling, run on virtual networks, and even completely isolate the functions. So basically, depending on your app's requirement, you can deploy this even in an environment that is not serverless. So they're having different components of the environment being serverless. This service can be attached to an component that is server based, which allows you big flexibility for scaling up your service, and also running on different virtual networks. You can also isolate these functions depending on whatever requirement you have. There are different. The next is different hosting options within Azure. So we'll take this last service, then we'll continue tomorrow. First is the Azure App Service. So basically, you upload your code here for a website. Basically, the root directory that you're uploading to this should have an index.html file, and that will do the routing to whatever you want. You can have different types of things here. You can have a HTTP based service. Then you can also have different languages such as .NET Core, Java, Ruby, Node.js, PHP, Python, and it also supports for this is also supported for both Windows and Linux environment. So normally, there are people who also use containers for hosting. It is very easy to scale them up and scale them down. But when we're talking about this service, then As I said, infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. So when we're talking about hosting, it comes under platform as a service, and when we're talking about containers, it comes somewhere in between. So you are somewhere or the other more responsible for things. So when you don't want to be responsible for things and want things to work in a more automated manner, that is when you can use this service. So the different types of app services which are there are the web app service, the API apps, the web jobs, and mobile apps. The app service handles most of the infrastructure decisions you deal with in hosting web accessible apps. So the deployment can be managed and integrated into the platform. The endpoints can be secured. Basically, whenever you deploy the service, it sets it gives the different endpoints that can be used. They can also a particular key can be used for them to access this service, and you can also introduce multiple endpoints. Sites can be scaled quickly to handle high traffic loads. This service can be scalable depending on whatever things you the parameters you are setting in. And there are built-in load balancing and traffic manager. So like normally we had two virtual machines and multiple virtual machines having a load balancer, and the load balancer trafficking routing the traffic to different machines. What you can do is you can use this service for hosting, and you need not depend on any other things, and this will automatically handle all that load balancing and traffic management stuff for you, and again scale up and down depending on your needs. So also that scaling part also you can manage and declare according to whatever wants, not wants, whatever requirement you have. Then about web apps, what basically web apps is that it includes full support for hosting web apps such as ASP.NET, ASP.NET Core, and the different languages that were uh, mentioned above. And it is available in both of the operating system, Linux as well as Windows. API apps is a hosting is much like of a hosting service. You can build a REST based API by using your choice of language and framework. You can get full Swagger support and the ability to package and publish your API in Azure Marketplace. So you can create that API app, and you can also publish this to Azure Marketplace, where this can be purchased by people and used by other people also. The produced apps can be consumed from any HTTP or HTTPS based client. So as long as you have an HTTPS based client, you will be able to use this API apps. Not just API apps, basically the app you create using this API app can be used from any HTTP and HTTPS based web based client. Then web jobs is a feature to run a program, basically exe program, which can be created from any language, or a script that is .cmd or bat. So these are different formats. For example, .cmd will execute the command line, .bat will execute a batch script within PowerShell. Then again there is .sh. I think that might be a choice, but it hasn't been showed here, a bash script. Yes, they have explained, they have included bash also. So based on whatever script you want, you can create an .exe file, cmd, bat, or also bash scripts, which can run in these web jobs. So they can be scheduled or run by a trigger. So based on a trigger or a schedule that you're providing the web job will be running, and it can be often used to run background tasks as a part of application logic. So for example, if you want to refresh a database and apply to some checks or different things to a database or some other thing that needs to be regularly done, then you can use this instead of having a and help to provide high availability. Then there are mobile apps. Mobile apps. The main feature is to build a backend for an iOS and Android app with just with just few actions in the Azure portal. So instead of adding different softwares in your background and configuring them, all you need to do is some clicks on your Azure portal, and you can quickly create a backend for your iOS or Android app. Store mobile application data in a cloud-based SQL database. So it has inbuilt cloud database which you can access and use this service in. Authenticate customers against common social providers such as MSA, Google, uh, Twitter, and Facebook. Send push notifications. So there are different things that come under mobile application development. So whenever you are creating an app, you want to authenticate your users. So normally the common thing whenever you are signing into some application, then we see sign in with Google, sign in with Twitter, sign in with Facebook. So you just using a click, you can add that thing to your application instead of writing a lot of code for it and configuring that with they are different providers. Send push notifications. Push notifications are nothing but notifications that come on the top of your screen. So you can send push notifications directly using these mobile app application. That is a service of Azure. Then execute custom backend logic in C# or Node.js. So if you want to execute any particular logic that you want to run in your backend, then you can write that in C# or Node.js and execute it in this particular service. Also, there is SDK support for native iOS and Android, Xamarin, and React Native apps. So I think we'll continue networking, and I think the next is mostly about networking. Basically, this is networking. Then is virtual private networks, private networking that you want to hide from different networks and only access to say, certain people. Then express route, again networking, and DNS knowledge check. Okay. Pascal, do you wish to add something? And does anyone have any doubts?
Yeah, just to help to talk about networking, just to give an overview. So Azure networking, it's about a virtual network. So this virtual network, which allow your resources to communicate and each other. For example, when you deploy, for example, you host your app, your app will need a network to communicate. And with this virtual network, it's some kind of emulation of what's a physical network. So just go at an idea how local IT environment work is just is a way that cloud computing environment work. Just it simulates virtually, and inside Azure Virtual Networking, because it's a private network, you will need some tools or maybe some other services that can allow you to communicate publicly. That's why you will see you will see, for example, Azure Express Routes. This is this is Express Routes. It's a services which allow you, for example, let's see, for example, you can have two sites. One site is it's located, for example, in India, and another site it's located, for example, in South Arabia. And to communicate between these sites, you can use, for example, Azure Express Route. This is just an example. So Express Route, it's allow for your your services which is inside cloud computing. It allow you to communicate each other, and Express Route can allow you to communicate publicly, like share informations. And firstly, when you are creating your resources like virtual machine, you will need to define a virtual private network where is the resources which your resources will use to communicate. Yeah.
So thank you. Does anyone have any doubts? Also, I'll be sharing a website using which you can get a free voucher for this examination. If you're a student, you'll just have to use your student email to verify that you're a student, and as soon as that is done, then you can get a certification voucher for AZ 900. Another thing, there are some people who I think might not have registered for Azure for Students, so I'll also be sharing that link as well. Also, GitHub Student Developer Pack. Does anyone have any doubts, or should we wrap up for today? I'll take that as a